Excellencies, everyone, welcome this morning to the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. My name is Torunn Tryggestad. I'm the Deputy Director here at PRIO, and I'm also heading the PRIO Centre on Gender, Peace and Security. And it's a great pleasure for me to wish you all welcome to this event on Women Mediators Capacity Building Programs, an effective tool in grassroots mediation. This is an event that we are co-hosting with the South African Embassy here in Oslo, and it forms part of the commemoration of the Women's Month in South Africa. South Africa and Norway have for many years collaborated in various capacity building initiatives for women mediators. Many of these initiatives have focused on the inclusion of women in formal peace processes, and on increasing the number of women as special envoys or mediators, chief mediators in conflicts, meaning that these initiatives have had a particular focus on what is often referred to as track one processes. Among these initiatives, we also find the Nordic Women Mediators Network, which was launched in Oslo in November 2017. Together with NOREF, the Norwegian Centre for Conflict Resolution, the PRIO Centre on Gender, Peace and Security have been fortunate enough to serve as operational partners to this initiative. And we are responsible for the activities of the Norwegian branch of Nordic Women Mediators. The creation of this Nordic network was inspired by networks of women mediators in South Africa and the Southern African region. And the then South African ambassador to Norway was our guest of honor during the launch. So I think it's fair to say that there has always been a special bond between South Africa and Norway in relation to the Nordic Women Mediators Network. While many of the activities of the Nordic Women Mediators have focused on high-level diplomatic processes, at today's event, we will explore how collaboration on capacity-building initiatives can be expanded to also include mediation training for women at the grassroots level. We have a panel of distinguished speakers. Some will be here in the room. A few others will join us online, and they will share their thoughts and experiences with us on this topic. But before we move to the panelists, please let me introduce to you Her Excellency Dolores Kotze, the South African ambassador to the Kingdom of Norway, and she will give the keynote. But just a few words about the ambassador. She has more than 30 years of professional experience, with 14 years at the senior management level in government, of which 10 years as head of planning in the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And in May 2022, she was appointed as South Africa's ambassador to the Kingdom of Norway and is also accredited to the Republic of Iceland. So she is relatively fresh here in Oslo, but we are all the more happy to welcome you here to PRIO. So please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, on behalf of the government and the people of the Republic of South Africa, I am delighted to welcome you to this event co-hosted by the South African Embassy and the Peace Research Institute Centre here in Oslo. It's a special honor and privilege to welcome today's dialogue, which takes place in the context of a broader global conversation about the role of women in peace processes. Within the South African context, this conversation today takes place during the Women's Month, the month of August. South Africa commemorates Women's Month as a tribute to the more than 20,000 women who marched to the union buildings in Pretoria, protesting against the legislation aimed at tightening the then apartheid government's control over the movement of Black women in urban areas and the pass laws. On 9 August 1956, the Federation of South African Women, led by 4 great women, Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Rahima Moosa, Sophia Williams de Bruyn, delivered their petitions to the then Prime Minister's trade room at the Union Building. Thousands of women throughout the country in South Africa put their names to these petitions, indicating their anger and frustration at having their freedom of movement restricted by the hated and degrading official passes they had to carry with them wherever they went in South Africa at that time. Although the minister wasn't there at the union buildings at the time, the women of South Africa collectively sent out a resounding public message that they would not be intimidated by and silenced by the unjust laws of the time. Based on this historical event, the government of South Africa declared the whole month of August as Women's Month, and 9 August celebrated as Women's Day annually. This was declared a national holiday in 1994, a day to commemorate the historic achievements of the women stalwarts in the struggles against oppression, as well as the pursuit of women's empowerment, advancement, and the achievement of gender equality. It is an honor and a privilege for me to celebrate and salute these women and many others who fought for gender equality. As the women of South Africa, we are indebted and grateful to these great women that stood up for their convictions. It has been 66 years since the 1956 March. The phrase, or the latest incarnation, which represents the song that the women sang, I just need to say it was 20,000 women, and they stood silent for 30 minutes in front of the union buildings where they came to deliver, and then they had a particular song. So the latest incarnation or rephrasing, and it is, I'm not going to try the native language, I was told how to do it, but the phrase is, you strike a woman, you strike a rock. And that theme has come to represent women's courage and strength in South Africa. As a group that has been marginalized, they rose to question barriers preventing the advancement and the enjoyment of their human rights, and fought for the emancipation of themselves and of their families. As we celebrate Women's Month 2022, we celebrate and applaud the women of 1956 and countless others who set the tone for gender equality and empowerment in democratic South Africa. Their brave actions inspired women to take their rightful place in parliament, government, and civil society. Through their sacrifices, we now live in a country which recognizes women as equal citizens with equal rights and responsibilities. Today, in our meeting, in our conversation today, we reflect not only on the participation of such women in peace processes, but in all the women in peace processes. According to the journal Council on Foreign Relations, between 1992 and 2019, women constituted on average only 13% of the negotiators, 6% of the mediators, and 6% of the signatories to peace agreements for major peace processes around the world. While we acknowledge there has been some process and progress to include women, but not enough, there is only about 7 out of the 10 processes do not include women. Negotiation and peace processes. Women therefore still remain significantly underrepresented in peace processes. We're looking at today the role for participation of women in formal and in informal peace processes. And we have many organizations driving those. And we have on our panel women representing those organizations. We're looking particularly at the role of women mediators at a grassroots level. Because when we consider the role of women, we have to consider the complete peace continuum. It is not only at the time when we negotiate for a peace agreement. We're looking at the work of women at grassroots level prior to the agreement, during the negotiation of the agreement, as well as the implementation thereof. Because women at a grassroots level are more accepted, they would be able to create peace communities, They will be accepted so that they can create peace committees, and they create a safe space for other women to support them and to talk. But it's also a place where an appetite for peace can be created at a community level. I am sure that the array of women organizations involved in peace mediation processes are doing many of these. But clearly, if we look at the statistics, more needs to be done. The capacity building that we should do should empower women at a grassroots level prior to the conflict. Early warning skills to see what can possibly give rise to conflict. So the skill set for capacity building should include skills for early warning, but also skills for possible de-escalation before the conflict actually erupts. In situations where the conflict already exists, the skill for mediation is required. Local ownership is imperative and it cannot be imported. If we import peace agreements and peace processes, then we know the chances of success fails, because local ownership will contribute to the longevity and the success of the implementation of peace agreements. In addition, capacity building should include the skills to draft the peace agreement and as well skills for constructive and inclusive mediation. Capacity building for peace agreements, not only at grassroots level, but we also need to empower our women to stand up, to be ready to take up positions as elected government officials once a peace agreement has been established. So that's what I mean when I say on the complete peace continuum. Prior to the conflict, anticipate what can happen, possible de-escalation during the negotiations, but also afterwards when we have to implement it. In order to make a difference in the conflict areas, we need to expand our capacity building for peace ambassadors. We need to honor the women who came before us, and we need to empower the women that come after us. Let us together build a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's important to keep the histories alive, not least the recent history in South Africa. Okay, so let's move now to the next session of this event. And now we will invite our distinguished panelists to join us. And we will start out with Signe Gilling. And she is the Special Representative of Women, Peace and Security at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she has covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from 1992 to 2010, both as a researcher for the Refugee Working Group, as head of the People-to-People Secretariat, and for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she has been Deputy Head of Mission in Juba, and followed then by 3 years as Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy in Riyadh, where she had the main responsibility for Yemen. And on top of this, I would like to add that she is also a member of the Nordic Women Mediators Network. So you are a very experienced woman when it comes to the matters we are going to discuss here today. Signe, the Norwegian government is a strong supporter of the women, peace and security agenda, both normatively, politically, and financially. And we were talking a little bit in the introduction here that traditionally we have maybe focused a lot on the political level. So what is the ministry's take on the whole issue of building capacity of women mediators at the grassroots level?
Yes, first of all, thank you for being invited. And I also want to say that we have a very strong bilateral relation with South Africa. We have an MOU that we follow up, and we're also working together on young women mediators. So this is in the heart of what my colleagues in the Peace and Reconciliation Department is doing in the ministry. So I just want to recognize our very strong and long-term relations with South Africa and Women, Peace and Security. And I should also mention maybe that I think South Africa was a very strong inspiration when we created the Nordic Network in 2015. So yeah, I get goosebumps right now. Yeah. First of all, we had the breakfast this morning with the foreign minister and all the ambassadors, because they are all in Oslo this week on peace and reconciliation, and we have a lunch on women, peace and security with the same group later on today. So I'm wearing jogging shoes because I need to run in between. First of all, I think it's important to look at the whole spectrum, as you say. I think the linkages is some of the challenges. How do we move talented mediators from grassroots upwards, or how are they being supported throughout the chain, and how do they build constituency as mediators? Because I think, as you said, rightly said, on the local level, women are quite often prominent. Like from Yemen experience, I would say that I think maybe women have been able to negotiate on prison release more prisoners than the formal process. And they are very close connected, with ICRC and all these mechanisms, which is quite low-key, but I'm sure that they are very active. They have also been very active, like in PRIO on water rights for the city. They are very active on roads, access of roads, and so on. And they are having support from families and from local communities, but none of them are in the formal negotiations, you could say. And lately, no women have been in the government. So there is a gap between what is going on in grassroots and what's going on the formal. And then also very, very often in prolonged conflict, you don't have a formal peace agreement or a process. You have a process, but you are not negotiating an agreement because they haven't come to that position yet. And then it's come later. But then actually, when are you in a position where you give input to this process, so that you steer the process in the direction you want as women? Because of course this has to do with the women's daily life, and it has to do with their future. So they should have been. It should have been a kind of a mechanism, and I think that's quite intricate, and it's specific in every conflict, and that's also why I have been sort of emphasizing to build solid academic environment also that is connected to conflict resolution, and that it needs to be regional and it needs to be national, not just international. When we are now in the Security Council, we are working very closely with Norwegian research institutes. We consult them regularly. I mean, PRIO, CMI, all of them. So I think also sometimes resources is not really being put enough to strengthen institutions in countries like South Sudan. In countries, you know what I mean, because they when you saw when the South Sudanese women jumped into the revitalization of the peace process, and they linked up with the professors at the Yuba University and so on, they came in with quite strong language on the revitalized agreement. And it was this connection between grassroots women or activist women and academia, I think, who managed, who sort of guided this process, where they strengthened both the chapter on security, not least on constitution, and also I think on humanitarian and economic assistance. So, yeah. So this is a big topic, but I think that's it's some of the things I have been pushing for since I started the work in April, not so long time ago, but yeah. So and I also think that some of these discussions needs to be taken into the in the forums of, yeah, we have the Nordic network, we have the global network, which we support very strongly. You have the African Union, and it's really this trick how we manage to open the door for women, and I think the young women mediators, they are many and they are visible, and it's a lot of good talents. But of course, when you are seeking positions as a main mediator, I think that goes for all of us. You need the support of someone. So it's always about backing, I think.
I think it was very interesting what you said about the linkage between researchers and civil society organizations, because that's always been there, especially when it comes to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. There's always been a very strong link, and researchers have maybe going in and out a little bit of, being researcher one day and maybe an activist the next, but it has played a very important role in building, knowledge-based initiatives, both for policymakers and civil society. And now let's see if technology is with us. We have 3 more panelists, but they are participating online. And a couple of them are representing civil society organizations that the ambassador mentioned. There are a number of them out there working at the grassroots level. And the first one I would like to introduce is Karishma Raju. She is working at the African Centre for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes in Durban, South Africa. Good morning. Can you hear us well?
Yes, I can. Good morning, Turin. Good morning, everyone.
Before I give you the floor, I will just introduce you a little bit to the audience here. Karishma, she is the general manager for programs at Accord. Accord is an organization that strives to bring creative African solutions to the challenges posed by conflict on the African continent. And Karishma has served in various capacities at Accord, including as senior program officer for the Training for Peace program and special projects coordinator at the executive office. And prior to joining Accord, Karishma worked for the Democracy Development Program as a project coordinator and held a position as assistant foreign civil service officer at the Department of Foreign Affairs in South Africa. So now, Karishma, working at Accord, maybe you can say a few words about what's Accord's experiences now and lessons learned from supporting women's mediation efforts at the grassroots level. You've been working on this now for many years.
Turin, thank you very much. And I'll stand on existing protocol in terms of greeting everybody in the venue this morning, as well as the colleagues that are joining us online. I want to start where Ambassador Kotze made reference to the number of stats in relation to women having to play an instrumental role in mediation efforts. Now, I know that this is not new information, but I think what it does is bring into question the role of the many capacity building initiatives and programs that were intended to actually enhance the implementation of the commitments that were made and the myriad of policy frameworks. And if the numbers are showing a bleak picture, I think what we need to understand is that if we take this approach, we start to miss the larger framing of the women, peace and security agenda. The numbers only tell us one story. And they certainly not for a lack of effort amongst the many, many women. And if we look at our continent in terms of Africa, for more than 25 years have been mobilizing and galvanizing their efforts towards ensuring that the aspiration for meaningful participation in peace processes is certainly achieved. We know that in achieving this goal, the many conflict prevention and mediation networks that were created speak to capacity building as an effective tool. But we know that for women mediators, what this space actually means is beyond skill sharing. It is about having to broaden access, the ability to share good practice, to be able to share expertise, to create more learning opportunities amongst peers, and to also create awareness and knowledge building from and for each other. So when we talk of the continuum that seems to be the theme on the context of this particular session, the intention is how do we bring those aspects into the capacity building element? I'd like to reflect on 2 elements of work that we have done. And I know that Sina just mentioned the African Union's network of African women in conflict prevention and mediation. And to many, this is the FemWise Africa network. So in 2020, we know we cannot speak of 2020 without recognizing the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and what was happening across the world. but recognizing that at that time, many communities, especially women in these communities, were showing a level of resilience during the pandemic. But for us on the African continent, the potential for conflict was anticipated, as what the pandemic did was expose and compound existing vulnerabilities, especially in already affected countries by conflict. We didn't want to find ourselves worse off and therefore sought to draw on key players within the FemWise network towards conflict prevention at the country levels. What this capacity building initiative did was start to link theory to practice, but took into account the outcomes of the FemWise Africa Secretariat's regional consultations, which were around 2019, and looked at how we could decentralize the network and establish national and regional chapters, which, given the context of the changing conflict environment and recognizing that it was shifting to a local and national level and more levels of unrest and more levels of violence at this level, what it did was demonstrate how women's networks could be strengthened through learning and having to share encounters through knowledge sharing sessions. Now, closer to home for me in the South African context, and what Ambassador Kotze shared has been the long history of South African women having to fight for their emancipation and gender equality as a whole. And they have certainly been the effective drivers of their own change. What we've seen is while women in South Africa face socioeconomic inequalities, which severely affect their levels of access to education, the economy, to their basic rights, to a legal system, protecting women against gender-based violence and other forms of violence, as well as creating a peaceful and inclusive society, does indeed pose a challenge for us. But yet what we recognize in terms of South Africa's success is its ability to be able to implement the central tenets of Security Council Resolution 1325, which came even before our adoption of our National Action Plan on WPS. What it recognized was the significance of women in its own peace process, which had come from strong women-led community-based organizations and NGOs, whose leaders were able to use their voices and to challenge the status quo and break gendered barriers within the communities. So we reflect on women who have pushed and who continue to push up until today in the country for access, for shared knowledge and expertise, and also the opportunity to be able to learn from each other. We are able to see this through a program that we are working on with 15 women-led NGOs and CBOs across the provinces of the country. What this does is focuses on conflict management and facilitation training, but also strengthening their roles as women peace builders to play a role at the local and national levels and local governance aspects as well. We've been able to connect them through webinars into regional peace building programs, so looking at Zimbabwe and Uganda as key examples as well, and look at how related tools can actually be applied to the work that they are doing. We know that they can connect through their experiences and recognize that their context matters for how they design solutions and promote peace in their communities. In addition, we've worked on extending the program into a training of trainers project, realizing that capacity building for women mediators also needs to include tenets of leadership skills, one-on-one coaching sessions, the opportunities for them to teach their own sessions, and something as interesting and innovative as understanding where social media fits in this process as well, recognizing that information is also key in peace processes. They have been connected to other peace builders in the country through the South African Women in Dialogue, as well as to the Gertrude Chopin network, as well as the Gender is My Agenda campaign, which is an Africa-wide network. Now, they're able to identify early warning signs, navigate local conflict situations, and they continue to implement these conflict prevention mechanisms at a community level. But also, in acquiring such skills from this collaboration, they're able to provide immediate relief and longer-term transformative change by having to defend their own collective interests, increase their own levels of accountability, and also challenge prejudices within their communities. One last example that I want to speak to, and particularly for recognizing women when the country experienced a level of unrest in July last year. Here again, under the auspices of the Gertrude Chopin Women Mediators Network, South African women peace builders were convened under the Peace Table umbrella, having to reaffirm their commitment to democracy, the rule of law, as well as peace and security in the country. With local government elections that were looming around November, the women then convened again with several South African-based organizations to form the South African Women's Election Mechanism for Peace. While we recognize that many women had already undertaken courses in mediation and were ready to use their skills, it presented an opportunity to upskill and enable them to be at the forefront of having to prevent election-related violence, as well as report on gender-based violence during the election time, as they were able to serve as peace envoys, advocates, and messengers during this time. So what we see from these examples is that skills that have been acquired give local women the ability to provide both immediate relief and longer-term transformative change, as they have the opportunity to defend their collective interests, which we are key to supporting. Thank you so much. These are my initial reflections for now, and we can discuss more.
Thank you so much, Karishma, for sharing those examples. I think they were really interesting. We'll move straight on to the next panelist, also representing a civil society organization that is very active in a number of conflict mediation processes. Our next panelist is Sylvia Rognvik Thomsen. She is currently leading a mediation and dialogue effort in Yemen for CMI, the Mahdi Ahtisaari Peace Foundation in Helsinki, Finland. Sylvia has previously worked in various capacities with the UN on issues related to peace building, security sector reform and mediation, including with the UN Peacebuilding Support Office in New York. And she has worked for the United Nations Support Mission to Libya and the UN Women in Jordan. And you have a number of other, interesting positions, but I think we just have to cut it short here. But I would like to add that Sylvia is also a member of the Nordic Women Mediators Network. Sylvia, you have worked on the peace process in Yemen and on the political transition in Sudan for the past few years for CMI. Can you share with us some of your key lessons learned and reflections on today's topic of capacity building of women mediators at the grassroots level?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope you can hear me well. My picture is freezing a little bit, but hopefully you can hear me well. Well, I think one of the things I wanted to highlight from my recent experience from Yemen and Sudan is the importance of really kind of building processes around capacity building programs. I think that quite often they can become kind of a standalone initiative. And it's really important to kind of build proper processes around capacity building programs where you support the women you're working with to continue to apply the skills that they have acquired and to kind of support them throughout the process. And capacity building programs in general is a really good opportunity also to support women in strategizing and kind of particularly in terms of, well, one in terms of the partnership, but also in terms of how they kind of implement various recommendations and key objectives that they have identified in the various contexts. And also in terms of building kind of communication strategies, which speaks to Karishma's point, but also kind of more broadly how they as women kind of networks or alliances can build, can work jointly together. And this is also something that we have focused quite a lot on, is really to support women and how they can build a vision for what they want to achieve, not just in terms of kind of women's participation, but kind of more broader for the future of Yemen or the future of Sudan. And then afterwards, how to kind of work towards achieving that vision. And I think that's also, I think Signe also mentioned the case of Yemen, and we worked on that together before as well. That we know that here there's been quite a lot of kind of change in the narrative over the past years from this narrative of representation to more in terms of what is it actually that the different women groups want. So I think in Sudan, one of the things that we have been doing that I'd like to highlight is to work with MONSAM, which is a group of women political organizations. And of course, we have provided various trainings on mediation, and then also supported them in kind of applying those skills in building a process of trying to work with different civilian components and identifying the similarities and differences, and then trying to build consensus around the differences to really try to unify the civilian side vis-a-vis the military side. And within that also to kind of provide technical and logistical support in that process, and also supporting them in strategizing for the political alliance itself. And then in the case of Yemen, for example, one of the things I'd like to highlight here is the work we've done with women in political parties. We really recognize the importance of political parties as kind of a gatekeeper for women's meaningful participation in peace processes. And we've worked with them here on different capacity building programs, of course, providing mediation trainings, but also looking at a broader spectrum of skills that needs to be provided, which also speaks to the point of Ambassador Kotze in terms of what is it actually you're building capacities in. And I think in mediation, that's one of the aspects of it, but then also looking at other issues such as how to build effective advocacy strategies, and how and who do you target those towards, and how do you build alliances to be able to kind of unify, excuse me, to be more united. And then I think also experience sharing was mentioned here, which I think really is something that a lot of the women mediators we have worked with is something that they find really useful, and gives them a sense of not being alone in quite a complicated context, but also finding it useful to learn and understand that others have been doing the same, and they have been able to overcome a lot of the challenges that they are facing. And then a final point, I think, is that I think also that it's important to focus on capacity building of both men and women. So we look at, for example, with the political parties that we've been working with, that the trainings are also provided for the men, so that they also understand kind of the importance of women's inclusion and really understand the benefits and how a peace process can become more sustainable with women's participation. So that's one point. And then also I think also looking kind of more broader, so men and women, but also looking at if you want to really create inclusive processes, then looking at the grassroots level, for example, looking at how language may be a barrier, or just so that you don't focus necessarily only on kind of the urban centered elite when it comes to increasing capacities and linking their efforts to the official process, but also looking across the board at the local level, looking at kind of traditional leaders and women in tribal communities, etc. So that's a few thoughts and reflections, at least to start us off with. Thanks. Back to you, Torunn.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for now. Time is flying, so I think we just have to move straight on to the next panelist. Sylvia, you were mentioning that it is important to build processes around capacity building initiatives so that they don't become just one-offs, and that is often a question of funding then. So I think that's a nice segue to the next panelist, who is Rita El-Khayari. I hope I pronounce your name right. She is heading the Secretariat for the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, a United Nations and civil society partnership supporting women's organizations in peace and security and humanitarian contexts. And prior to joining the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, she acted as the deputy representative of UN Women in Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. Before joining UN Women in 2012, Rita served in different positions within the Moroccan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, including as an advisor to the minister and as the chief of staff of the Secretary General. I think I'll stop there with your bio, Rita. What is the United Nations Peace and Humanitarian Fund's experience and lessons learned from supporting these kinds of initiatives at grassroots level that also Sylvia and Karishma were talking about?
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. And thank you also to PRIO and to the South African Embassy for the invitation. It's really nice to be with you this morning. So as you mentioned, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund specifically focuses on local and grassroots women's organizations. And while we also support Track 1 and Track 2 efforts and women's participation in Track 1 and Track 2, I would like to focus, if that's okay, on what we do vis-a-vis capacitating women in Track 3 processes and how that works for us. So the reason why we support and the kind of rationale behind our support to grassroots women's organizations, including local women organizations and local women mediators, is based on the idea that these organizations have an added value that is based on their very thorough knowledge, including of the context and the stakeholders. Of course, the experience of local gender issues and gender issues in general, and also their ability to use local levers to advance the lines while improving women's influence. And this is something that we have seen across the board that has been really key to our support to women's organizations and local women's mediators. One other kind of very strong asset that we have seen across the board while supporting those organizations is how they have a very comprehensive approach to the issues, and they make the linkages, as it was mentioned already before, not only with mediation at local level, but also conflict prevention issues. So very often Track 3 mediation efforts become conflict prevention efforts as well at the same time. And very often as well, they can see the other issues that are a threat to peace and security in their communities. And sometimes it can be also economic issues and economic instability that causes also conflict, access to land, access to resources. So they're able to really kind of see all of the entry points and all of the factors that actually fuel into the conflicts, and starts very often, as we all know, at the very local level, and then they kind of spill over to the national level or cross-regional level. So for us, the approach that we take is that we recognize that they have the knowledge, and I think that was also mentioned before, they have the expertise, and what we do is that we just provide the additional, the extra mile, the additional logistical, technical, and financial support that they need to strengthen their action. So it's really based on the paradigm that they have the knowledge and that very they can bring about substantial and impactful change with very little support, and that they need the extra support that will allow them to be at the table and to bring their ideas. And often the extra support that will go a very long way is missing, and that's where the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund comes in. Many women peace builders and many women's organizations at the grassroots level, and this was also mentioned before by my colleagues, are willing to be more influential in informal dialogue spaces, but that also has as a purpose and as a final objective to influence formal processes. And I think it was also mentioned before that we are missing the links. I think Signe, you were the one who mentioned that. And I think that's probably something that also we need to work more on, is how do we link the Track 1 and Track 2 with the Track 3? And how do we make sure that the grassroots efforts also feed into the kind of formal peace processes? The reason why the women engaged at the grassroots kind of local mediation efforts They are very different based on the context and the experiences. Sometimes it's because they prefer actions far from the spotlight. It's also self-censorship from women who kind of have this kind of tendency to do that. Sometimes it's a risk mitigation strategy for their own security. So they would prefer to kind of avoid the spotlight and act as a more kind of lower level to not be on the spotlight. But also sometimes it's a very efficient and deliberate strategy to engage political actors. And sometimes it is easier for some men, and Sylvia was mentioning the necessity to train men as well, to accept informal invitations from women's organizations rather than having them as a first step formally in the peace process. I just wanted to also mention a couple of experiences that we had as a fund to support local women's organizations at the grassroots level, and our kind of signature project and what we started with when we were launched in 2016 is a support in Burundi to women's organizations that started. I think it's a famous kind of network now, which is the local women mediator network, which started as a couple of hundred women network, and then now is a over 1,600 women and young women mediators that have been linked to one another and have been addressing, averting or referring more than 10,000 conflicts since the beginning of their activities. And then again, to my point earlier, that they have a comprehensive vision of what they do. They started with addressing and mediating conflicts. They could be land related, they can be sexual and gender-based violence, they can be political, ethnic conflicts. And then they started doing community dialogues, including the local authorities and the local leaders as well. And then on the third kind of step of their action, they also started involving women in economic generating activity, recognizing that food insecurity and economic insecurity was also fueling into the tensions and the conflicts at the community level. So they have cumulatively reached approximately 1.8 million direct beneficiaries. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because the total population of Burundi is 11 million. So it's almost 10% of the population of Burundi cumulatively that they have potentially included in their mediation efforts. So the point is really to say that when they get, again, to my point earlier, the extra funding that they need, they are able to have impact, even starting at the grassroots level, really at scale in a way that that is very, very, very impressive. So I'll stop here if that's okay, and I'm happy to.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all the different panelists for this first round of introduction or reflections on experiences and lessons. We will allow ourselves a round now on where all the panelists are given a few minutes to, if there's something you want to pick up on and comment on any of the other panelists. Maybe I could start with you, Signal. Is there anything in particular you would like to pick up from what we've just heard?
Yeah, no, maybe just a comment on capacity building, because that's important. It's also important, as Gita say, how to empower each other nationally, locally, and in these networks of local mediators. I think that's also very important. But that said, the issue is all about participation and given the political space, because we do have a lot of negotiations or mediations where it's men participating with very little, you could say, knowledge of mediation. Maybe they have been in war and they are brought to the table because they are warlords. So I just want to point and to that and say that, well, it's also about political space, and it's about addressing that deficit for women. I think I just want to emphasize that and not to undermine capacity building as such, but I think there, as Gita said, there are so many skilled local mediators and successful mediators of women, and the fact that they don't get the space at the table, it's quite politically defined. So I think, yeah.
Thank you, Signe. Karishma, would you like to comment on anything of what you've heard from the other panelists? Are there anything in particular you would like to pick up?
Sure. Two aspects, I think. Well, Sylvia's mentioned the significance of, including men and women as part of the capacity building processes. I think one of the gaps that we should consider making stronger is the intergenerational one as well. And I think what Gita was referring to in the Burundi context, having to have young women inside that process is extremely critical, especially when we look at the demographic for the African continent. So I think emphasis there will be critical. And Gita's point on the fund, I think when we talk about local agency and wanting to promote and create unique spaces for local women actors to be able to contribute to peace processes, that corresponding element of having adequate resources is such a big component of that. Beyond the capacity building, how to actually also not just have the funds available, because, having the support and resources is one thing, but also ways in which you can actually learn the skills to access those kinds of funds, and how to mobilize resources yourselves in this aspect is also critical. And the final comment is when we talk about the networks and across all of the networks globally, I think what it needs to do is to start to connect individual members of the network to actual wider organizations and wider elements of communities as well, because I think that's disparate sometimes. We find individual members represented, but not connected, especially at a grassroots level, rather, for how we can actually build peace within communities as well. And at the other level, when we talk of the track one, for these women networks to also be able to connect to other conflicts response structures that exist. And if I think of the African Union, how do we go to the wider context of what mechanisms exist instead of having them as separate structures? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karishma. This whole issue of how to connect women to larger organizations, this is a big issue also being discussed among the Nordic women mediators. It is indeed a challenge. Sylvia, is there anything you would like to comment or pick up on what you've heard from the other panelists?
Well, maybe just briefly to say that I think it's really important to look at various capacities that can be strengthened, but also looking more broadly at how do you really create opportunities for women to engage in the peace process. In my experience, many of the women we engage with, they do already have the capacities, and as has been mentioned by many here. And then we really need to look at how do you kind of capitalize on the already existing efforts of local peacemaking and de-escalation, and how do you link that to the official process. And also when you're creating various kind of mechanisms for inclusion, how do you ensure that they are fully kind of representative as well, and that they have strong constituencies across the various contexts that you work in. And then maybe a final point to make is also kind of better understanding and further exploring how you can use technology as well to support women, women's participation in general, because it can help in kind of broadening the reach throughout various contexts, and also I think it speaks to the capacity building element as well, where you can use technology to increase capacities also. And I think that's also something we've experienced now during the pandemic, at least for us, where we actually started delivering some trainings online, which we would normally not do, but actually has been quite an effective tool as well. And beyond that, also how to use technology to increase the general inclusiveness in the peace processes. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. Gita, would you like to comment on any of the other panelists?
Yeah, thank you. very quickly, as I already commented when I spoke earlier, I just wanted to emphasize what has been said, I think, by Karishma on the learning point, because I think that's really key. So I think these organizations really have a lot to learn from each other, and we need to focus a little bit more on the peer learning. This is something that we're doing because we have a learning hub at the global level at the fund, but I think we need also a little bit more interaction and sharing between those organizations. And I really like also the idea of the tandems. This is something that we started piloting for another, it's not about mediation on humanitarian work, where we are kind of pairing a influential displaced women or women working on displacement with us local women's organizations working on the issue. And this is something that has actually worked pretty well. I think this is something that we could also think of doing with the kind of women mediators at a high level with more grassroots organizations, and see how that would work. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much. Ambassador, is there anything you would like to comment from what you've heard now?
I think that thank you so much for the rich experience from our panelists, very definitely. I think that, and I think it came from Gita, the case that for local intervention actually can serve as a preventative intervention. Because the experiences that she has shared, so that for me is something that just makes the case stronger for the involvement of women, because they're understanding the local context. But looking forward to a continued engagement on this particular topic. Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you to all the panelists. I've been taking notes. I am in no way going to try and summarize everything, but there are a few things that I took note of. I think first and foremost, when we are talking about capacity building, it's not a question of that women don't have the knowledge and the experience. It's a question of building capacities to support their efforts. Practically and oftentimes financially. And that's my second point, that there is a great need for resources. I think this is something that has been pointed out again and again and again by institutions and organizations like, for instance, UN Women. Also when they are producing their annual reports, and the Secretary General of the UN's report on the progress with the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Then I thought it was very interesting what Sylvia brought up, that it's really important to build processes around these capacity building initiatives, because I think for many years there have been too many one-offs. You come in, you organize a brilliant training session, and then nothing more happens. So there needs to be more of a process and system around all of these efforts. And then to the point that you also brought up, Ambassador, that women have comprehensive approaches, that they are also concerned about the activities they are involved in here and now can also be conflict preventive measures. I think this is something that we see again and again, not only in African context, but also in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world. And finally, I would like to pick up on this. I think several of you brought up the need of capacity building among men. And in that respect, I would like to mention that next week, PRIO, we are actually organizing something called the UN High-Level Seminar on Gender and Inclusive Mediation Strategies. This is something that we are doing together with CMI and the UN Department of Peacebuilding, Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. It's something we've been doing since 2013. And what we are doing is that we bring together 20 to 25 individuals, high-level individuals. We try to have at least 50% men, and simply bring them together in Oslo or Helsinki for 2.5 days of, we call it training, on how they can become more gender aware when they are planning mediation processes. What can they as individuals do to include more women? How can they be more aware of how to integrate language on women's rights and gender issues when they are negotiating peace agreements? And when we started out in 2013, we really have to nag people to come and push them and remind them of our invitations. Now, when we send out invitations, the list becomes full almost, immediately. So we don't have to, push men the same way as we did back in 2013. These are high-level individuals. We see that there is a genuine interest now, a growing interest in actually trying to move these topics forward. So I think that would be my final words as a sort of a summary. But I would, of course, also like to thank you very much, Ambassador, for taking the initiative to this event. And we have been talking a little bit about making this maybe an annual thing, but we will have to come back to that. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us here today, all of you in the room and all of you attending online. Thank you all for joining us. I think this has been a very interesting kickoff of what I hope will be many more events like this, where we actually discuss how to provide assistance to women at the grassroots level. So this is the end of the recording. Thanks, everyone.